You need compute services like virtual machines and app service to host your applications. It's highly likely your applications also need to store and retrieve data. SQL Server is an extremely popular way for applications to store and retrieve relational data. You can install SQL Server on an Azure virtual machine, but wouldn't it be nice to not have to worry about the server part of SQL Server? My name is Eric Boyd. I am an Azure MVP, a Microsoft Regional Director, and the founder of ResponsiveX, where we help customers run workloads and develop applications in Azure. Azure has a great platform as a service, or PaaS offering, for SQL Server databases called Azure SQL Database. With Azure SQL Database, you can create a database server and deploy your databases into Azure, but you don't have to manage any SQL Server infrastructure. Azure takes care of this for you. In this video, I'm going to show you how you can quickly get started with Azure SQL Database. The Azure SQL Database service lets you create a database in seconds without taking care of any infrastructure or managing software updates. And like the Azure App Service I created in the video of this series titled Getting Started with App Service, you get some free options and offers. As part of the free account offer, you get 250 gigabytes of SQL database for free. If you want to learn more about the free account offer, I'd encourage you to check out the video in this series titled Understanding Your Free Account. To create a SQL database in Azure, I could create it from the portal, use Bicep or Azure Resource Manager templates. I could use the command line tools, or I could even create a database from SQL Server Management Studio. In this video, I'm going to create a database using the portal. To get to the portal, I'll navigate to portal.azure.com in my web browser. I'll click Create a Resource, and from the Databases category, I'll click the Create link under SQL Database. I'll select a subscription and resource group first. Then I'll give it a name, and I'll click Create New to create a new server. I'll name it, select the region for this new SQL database server, and configure the authentication method. As a general rule, I'd prefer to disable SQL authentication and just use intra-ID authentication, but your application and clients connecting to your database might require SQL authentication. So you'll need to select the authentication method that works for your scenarios. I'll click Set Admin to select the intra-ID user or group that I want to use as the SQL admin, and press the OK button. I have the option to use a SQL Elastic pool, which provides a way to share compute and storage capacity across a group of databases instead of a single database. But today I'm going to configure performance characteristics for a single database, so I'll choose No. I can now select a workload environment. This will populate default values for settings based on whether I select development or production, and you can change the settings however you'd like. I'm going to select production, which will suggest a provisioned vCore model instead of the serverless vCore model. I will click Configure Database next to Compute and Storage to configure the performance and pricing of this database beyond the workload environment suggestion. In the service tier dropdown, you will see two groups that represent the vCore and DTU purchasing models. The vCore model stands for Virtual CPU Cores. Under vCore, you will see several options including General Purpose, Hyperscale, and Business Critical. The DTU model stands for Database Transaction Units. It's a model for pricing and performance that is an abstraction over the hardware characteristics. You provision a selected number of DTUs, for example, 10, 50, 100, or more, and the performance is relative to the amount of DTUs you selected. And that is a combination of things like CPU, memory, network I/O, and disk I/O. The vCore model is a lot more familiar to most of us. It's the model that lets you choose hardware characteristics, including the number of CPU cores, amount of drive capacity, and the amount of memory. I'm going to select General Purpose, and then you'll see I can select between Provisioned and Serverless for the compute tier. Provisioned provides dedicated resources for your database. You'll pay whether you use them or not, And the performance and throughput are capped by the size of your dedicated resources. Serverless means that you don't have resources dedicated to your database. Instead, the database will auto-scale and resources will get provisioned on demand. You'll only pay a per second cost based on the amount of vCores you actually use. I'm going to choose provisioned, and I expect most will because that's what they're most familiar with. But as you get going, you might also choose serverless. Serverless provides a cost-effective way to run SQL, especially for dev test scenarios, when you do not need the database always on at a certain performance and throughput level. Here's an opportunity to save some money. If you have software assurance-enabled SQL Server licenses, you can apply your existing licenses to Azure SQL Database and Azure SQL Managed Instance to remove the SQL Server licensing cost and just pay for the base compute infrastructure that powers your Azure SQL Database. I've selected 2 CPU cores and 32 gigabytes of max data size. I can also make this database more highly available and resilient to failures by enabling zone redundancy. This will spread my database across zones or data centers within a region. If a failure occurred causing an outage of the data center running my database, the other zones or data centers will take over and keep my database online. This capability is included in the business critical tier, but incurs an additional cost in the general purpose tier. And you'll find other features and capabilities depending on the model and service tier you choose for your database. I'm now going to press the Apply button. I will also select geo-redundant backup storage so that if there's a regional outage, I'll be able to restore from the paired region where the backups are replicated. The Networking tab provides additional configuration options for access controls and client connectivity to your database. The Security tab provides additional configuration options for security protections, server identity, and encryption keys. I can adjust these configurations later after I deploy my database, so I'm going to leave these defaults and press the Review and Create button. This will take me to the summary of what I'm about to create. I can then press the Create button to start the deployment. Now this can take from several seconds to a couple of minutes. So we'll let this deploy. While it's deploying, I do want to explain a few things about that configuration in a little more detail. The first is that I created a server. And before I did that, I told you Azure SQL Database is great because you don't have to manage infrastructure and software updates. But I created a SQL Database server. You need a server. You need a place to create your database. You need a place to centrally manage multiple databases. You might want to centrally manage things like SQL logins that are shared across multiple databases. So the server gives you a place to do that. You also need a server to connect to your databases. So that's why there's a SQL Database server. But you don't have to manage infrastructure. In fact, you don't have access to see a server console. It's fully managed by Microsoft. And powering your SQL databases and SQL Database Server are multiple server instances that are highly available. What you essentially have is an always-on availability group serving your SQL database. And you don't have to configure any of that infrastructure yourself. My database has deployed, and I'm going to click the Go to Resource button. This will take us into the details of that database. Now, one of the things that you might notice is that the server name is a fully qualified domain. It's a fully qualified domain because it's a public cloud service, and we have to get to it from anywhere. I'm going to paste that into the server name field when connecting to a server in SQL Server Management Studio. Now I can select SQL Server Authentication and enter the SA username and password. But because I also enabled Intra ID authentication, I'm going to use my Intra ID credentials and press Connect. Now, even though SQL Database is a public cloud service, when we created the database, we didn't configure network connectivity to allow access to the database. And that is why we see this error when we try to connect. So I'll go back to my SQL database in the Azure portal and enable connectivity to my database. In this case, I'm going to enable public access from my PC by adding a firewall rule allowing my IP address to connect. But there are several options here, including allowing access from specific virtual networks all Azure services, and even creating private endpoints to restrict public access altogether. Once I'm done configuring network connectivity, I can go back to SQL Server Management Studio and attempt to connect to the database again. It will authenticate my credentials, check my permissions, and allow me to work with this database. And I can manage the schema and objects from SQL Server Management Studio just like any other database, regardless of where it is. Before I wrap up, I'd like to invite you to join me at our weekly Azure Live Q&A session. During the 30-minute session, I will host an interactive and live Q&A to answer your Azure questions.